Can you explain why you made the selection that you did tonight?
Yeah, we've been watching Hugo for a long time. He's obviously been on everybody's radar, I think, for a long time. And then, followed his year with a great Real Madrid organization and team and closely, and watched him in all the, U18s and those types of things. And just a big fan of how he plays. He's tough. He's hard playing. He cuts. He goes after the ball. He competes. He's got all the intangibles of a winning basketball player. And there's things he can get better at, just like everybody else at that age. But competitiveness is not, it's at a high level.
Is the plan to bring him over right away? And being a young guy, we've been operating under the past few years that you guys are, win now. He seems to be on a different timeline. Can you explain maybe what that...
I think he's a young guy, but a little bit of an old soul. I think he's played with adults for a long time. He's playing on a team full of experienced former NBA players and, high level pros from all over the world. So this guy has been around at a high level, been coached really well. So he'll be, I think when you talk about years overall, yes, he's young, but years of basketball experience, of the things that, we will think are important, it's probably pretty high.
Brad, when you get to this point in the draft, late first round, the balance of sort of best player available versus team fit versus sort of what you talked about, the timeline and the experience, how much of those factors went into selecting Hugo, and what about him made him the blend of sort of all those things coming together at this point?
I think when you're in the draft, you've got 15 roster spots, and then you have 3 extra two-ways. And when you're talking about the draft, you've got to find guys that you think are going to be good fits for how your group plays, and will bring the competitiveness and competitive character required to be a part of your group. And so I thought there were several good players still available there late, and we'll go back to the drawing board and look at what we're going to do tomorrow. But we were really excited that Hugo was available at 28.
Brad, I don't know how much you can say about some of the reported moves at this point, but in terms of the strategy to begin the offseason here as you developed it, addressing the second apron, addressing the luxury tax payments, how have you guys gone about the decisions you could potentially make there to downsize from a second apron standpoint, from a tax standpoint?
Yeah, I don't think we need to go into any specifics. I think the biggest thing is there clearly is a need to prioritize regaining our flexibility and, maximizing from an asset standpoint what we can. But, as far as whatever moves that those are a part of, they're all separate and, hard, and things that, are going to be, you're just going to have to do your best to make sure you put yourself in the right positions. But, I do think that this is about, we do have to, and we knew this was coming, right? This isn't a huge surprise. We have to make sure we prioritize that flexibility. Obviously, we got other things that we got to prioritize. We got to prioritize JT's health and make sure that he comes back fully strong. JB had a surgery, although his timeline to be back will be much quicker, obviously, but and obviously ready at the start of the season. And so, I think the biggest thing for us is just making sure that we, balance that, maximizing what we can with regard to what we bring back, so we can, continue to build and grow.
When you have an incoming ownership group like you do here, what's the communication process like in terms of luxury tax, the commitment to spending, that sort of thing, as they transition?
Our owners, old and new, are committed to spending. There's a lot of things that go into these moves, and a lot of things that are really important. And listen, again, it goes back to prioritizing our flexibility. And, I think the second apron basketball penalties are real. And I'm not sure I understood how real until they were staring me in the face in the last month. So I do think that there's, I think that can't be overstated.
Right. You said a little while back about how when you were looking at managing this team over like a 10-year period, you were trying to keep the peaks and valleys from being, or maybe the valleys from being too low. How is the second apron shaped that vision, and how is maybe this summer kind of an example of that?
The biggest challenge for our team is our first team All-NBA players in a boot. That's number one, right? So we know that going into next year. And then everything else is is second to that as far as how we build, grow, and improve as much as we can. And over the course of time, I said when I sat down in front of everybody a few weeks ago, my goal is to compete for championships. And, there will be inevitably a lot that goes into being in the mix for those. And we just have to, again, prioritize the health of those two guys, and then also at the same time, make sure we're regaining some of our flexibility.
Hey, Brad, you touched on it a little bit. What are your, priorities for the rest of the offseason for this point? Al and Luke obviously are free agents. There's a void potentially at center there, and you guys are under the second apron now, but are entering the first year in repeater tax potentially. Do you have the green light to stay in the tax if that's a route you guys want to go in?
We talk about everything as it goes, and obviously as I just told you, and I'll repeat it over and over and over, we need to regain our flexibility. Like we need to maximize assets in return, and we need to regain some flexibility here, and whatever that means from a final cost standpoint is what it means. But I think the biggest thing is, as you look at the rest of the team and what we're trying to do, I mean, there's no question our priorities would be to bring Al and Luke back. I mean, those guys are like huge parts of this organization. They're going to have, I'm sure, plenty of options all over the place, and that's well deserved. But I think that would be a priority, and at the same time, I don't want to put pressure on them. It's their call ultimately, but we would love to have those guys back.
You've mentioned Jason a couple times. Do you have any update on what his projected timeline might be?
And we don't, and we won't. We won't put a projected timeline on him for a long, long time. And as we look at it, there's no reason to. It's baby steps right now. He's actually progressed great, but I don't know what that means with regard to projected timelines, and that'll be in consultation with him and Nick and Phil Coles and everybody else to make sure that he is, when he hits the court, he is fully ready and fully healthy, and that will be the priority.
Brad, I know you mentioned you guys are bringing Hugo over. Do you know if he'll be here for Summer League, or is that not?
It's a good question. I think they just finished up a game tonight. I just talked to him. It's 5 a.m. over there. I said, enjoy your night. He goes, it's a little late. So I said, okay, maybe I'll enjoy it for you. And then, so I don't know. I mean, you're always anxious to get your guys over and do that. Literally, they play so late that we'll see how he's doing and see how it feels. Summer League won't define what his career will look like over the course of time, although we'll all be antsy to see him, right? That's just kind of the way we're wired. There's nothing else to do in July.
And then when you have a guy who didn't play as much for a really good Real Madrid team, you mentioned you guys have been looking at him for a while. What's sort of that process like when you have a guy who the year before he's drafted didn't necessarily put up the crazy stats or get a ton of minutes versus that?
Yeah, I mean, he's playing for us. He's playing around a bunch of studs, guys that have been old pros. They know how to play. They're hard to beat out. They're physical, tough, smart. Again, extremely well coached. When you are that age in that situation, you got to earn your stripes. We played against this when we took our team there years ago in the preseason. We played against a 16-year-old Doncic that hardly got in, right? So Hugo's a little bit older, and I'm not comparing him to Doncic, but I will say it's great when you get to play on those teams. When you put on a Real Madrid jersey, you put on the responsibility similar to here, right? And I think that's a good thing. When we interviewed Hugo a couple weeks ago on Zoom, it's really clear that he's about the team, and he accepts and is willing to play any role it takes. That's not a learned trait for everybody that's in the draft, because most of these guys have never sat. And with that comes a humility and also an understanding that you got to invest every day just to take advantage of whatever opportunity you get.
Brad, typically later in the first round is harder to predict, or more difficult to project what a player could become down the road. You selected Baylor last year and now Hugo this year. What goes into your guys' assessment of trying to figure out what these guys could become and their potential down the road?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, and maybe it goes back to an earlier question about age or whatever. Guys that we think are really good players that fit the fabric of how we want to play from a physical, competitive, and toughness standpoint, we'll try to prioritize. And Baylor fit that last year, and I thought, Baylor started off really slow. He struggled right out of the gate, and then I thought he played great at the end of the season, and we're excited about his future. And sometimes people think that a 24-year-old's old and can't get better. And we just talked about, we'd love to have our 39-year-old back. There's a long road ahead for a lot of these guys. And for me, it was, again, goes back to I look less about the age and more about kind of the competitive character, the makeup.
Brad, I know there's.
Sorry. You obviously lost Austin and previously Remy. What's the process going to be like, front office wise?
Yeah, I mean, we really missed Remy tonight. That's what I'd say. But I didn't miss Austin at all. No. I'm happy for Austin. We talked about Remy before. I'm so happy for both of them. Remy going to be the GM of a couple of Arkansas sports, and then Austin getting a chance to be the president. I loved his draft tonight. He did a great job. I could have told you 2 years ago he was going to trade up and try to get Clayton. So I wasn't surprised to see Utah do that, but it's super fun to watch people grow and get an opportunity. I think a lot of times when we'll fill some spots here over the next couple months, a scouting role or two, and maybe somebody here in house that kind of leads that group or is around that group every day, kind of in a similar type role to Austin. But I think that in the near term, we have a lot of really talented people up there that have stepped up and worked more and put their head down. And I mean, I've leaned a lot on Mike, and I can go through the whole group. When I say everybody picked up about 10% more in the last month, because we have a lot to do, and it feels like it's been a lot in the last month to get to this point. No. But I want to reiterate, like, the very best thing is when you get to watch somebody you worked with go achieve a dream. That's awesome.
Brad, I know there's still a lot of uncertainties this offseason around what this team will look like next year. We've heard the term retooling, rebuilding, all those kind of floating around in the media. How would you describe where you guys are at, and what are some things you can say are certain or likely about next year's roster?
Well, I think we're certain to have some really good players on our roster, right? I mean, even you look at our roster right now today, we've got a lot of really good basketball players that have done a lot of good things in this league, and several of them have done a lot of great things here. And so we'll see how it all pans out and what it all looks like. But I expect us to go out and compete and, compete with all we've got to be the very best we can. And that will always be the case. And we'll do our best to put the right group together and at the same time regain some flexibility and maximize some asset return. But I do think we've got a good group, and it's we've got the foundation, obviously, with Jalen and Jason and D. White and Peyton and all those guys that, a lot of teams would love to have.
Brad, you guys, the last couple of years, obviously leaned a lot into 3-point shooting rate with, success a couple years ago and some variance there last year. With the changes in personnel, obviously Jason's injury, how do you kind of view that going forward for you guys? And what did you learn essentially from just, removed a month removed from the series against the Knicks now, and what you saw through the rest of the playoffs in terms of how you guys kind of want to build going forward with tactically on that front?
There'll be Joe's call on how we guard and how we attack on offense. I mean, I think there's things that we can do better, and I know Joe has already, traveled the world to meet with people and talk about some things, and I think that he was excited to do that. He's actually at a conference tonight talking about leadership. Like, he's always trying to learn and grow, and so I believe wholeheartedly in him and our staff and figuring out how best maximize our team. And that'll be up to them. I think the thing that I took away, I talked about the Knicks series a little bit. I mean, I think it really boils down to those first two games in a lot of ways in my mind. I don't know Jason's injury. Who knows what you do if that series is 3-1 you at that time, and do you finish it out or whatever the case, right? Things can go different ways, but I thought the part of those games that stood out to me was more than anything when we got stagnant and we played without pace, and you could just feel it. You could see the walking up. You see all that. And I think we're going to try to address some of that. I think if you watch the finals, I think the two teams that deserve to be playing were playing. It wasn't about anything else. The best two teams in the league were playing. They played awesome. They deserved to be there. They outplayed everybody. They played really, really hard, the right way. So, we were that team last year, and, we'll strive to be that team again. It's no knock on anybody else that had a good run or a late season or won a couple playoff series or what else. But, man, watching those games, I hope everybody got a chance to, enjoy it as a basketball fan, because those Indiana-Oklahoma City games were amazing.
With Phil becoming the head coach in Maine, what did you see from him this year that let you know he's ready for that step? And with Tyler coming back to Boston, what did you see from him and his growth while in Maine?
Have we even announced that yet? Well, we're going to announce it now. Let's announce it now. No. First of all, with Tyler, I thought Tyler did a great job in his 1 year. I think Joe, has always really valued both of those guys, and so really gave Tyler the option, to stay or come back, and that was part of the deal that we talked about last year. And so I think we're obviously excited to have him back in Boston and on our staff. He's a really good coach, does a great job with not only the X's and O's but all the player development. The question was, how did you know Phil was ready? Well, we're throwing him up there, right? It's fun. This is part of it. And I've thought Phil was ready for this from the first time I coached him when he was 21 years old and a rookie point guard for the Boston Celtics, right? He's always really cared about the game. He cares about people. He's got a great work ethic. And yeah, he's got a lot to learn. He'll learn it on the fly. But how else would you better learn it than going and being thrown to the wolves and calling the shots? And so it's a great opportunity. Listen, we're going to keep using the G League as a great opportunity to grow our players, but this is also a place to grow our coaches. And, from everybody that we've had up there recently, the track and success from Joe and on has really been good.
And then you obviously can't talk about moves that aren't official yet, but I was curious if you've spoken to any of the names involved that might be heading elsewhere and what you conveyed to them.
I speak to everybody. I've spoken to everybody. I'm not going to talk about it because I can't. Which, obviously, anytime you make trades, those are tough conversations. But I do, I tried my best to. I've tried my best to communicate in general that what our priorities were that I talked about here.
Hi, Brad. Talk about Jason's injury. I'm just wondering how Jalen's doing kind of out of the surgery, and just what have your communications kind of been like in the past few days?
Well, Jason has been here pretty much every day, and then Jalen traveled a little bit before he got the surgery and then has been back most of the time after, and he's doing great. His rehab looks good. He was actually on the court the other day doing some ball handling and doing some light work around the rim. Nothing big movement-wise yet, but I think his timeline is, again, we said be ready for training camp, and I think he'll be probably going full, well ahead of that. But we'll see. So we've seen both those guys very frequently. Jalen's been in here working with Drew Moore and on all of his rehab, and Jason with Nick, and it's usually the time of the year where I don't see those guys a lot. They usually go and kind of rest and get away, but they've both prioritized getting better and rehabbing, and after a long season, I appreciate that about them.
Final two questions, Justin and John. Brad, you mentioned the intangibles in regard to Hugo. Is there anything in regard to his skill set that stands out to you the most that you admire?
Cutting and just a willingness to do sacrificial things, I guess. We talk about sacrificial cuts that open up opportunities for other people. We talk about sacrificial cuts that end up in you getting an offensive rebound. We talk about sacrificing your body on defense. We talk about competing on defense. We talk about flying back in transition and blocking a shot and catching up to a play. Those are the things that he's willing to do that I like. I think he will become a better shooter. I believe that, and we've got a good development program for that. And so I'm excited about him.
Brad, has there been any discussion with Joe Mazzulla about a contract extension?
Joe and I, first of all, I'll keep any of those discussions in-house. But we've got Joe under contract for multiple years right now. And so we certainly want Joe to be around here for a long time.
Thank you, Brad.
Thanks.